Today in this lecture, we will learn about the Metaphysical School of Poetry. We will learn about its origin, its development, its important characteristics, important poets, certain critics who commented on the school of poetry, its place in the history of English literature, and at the same time we will see some important works and key concepts of the school of poetry. Dear friend, the lecture is full of information, so I request you not to skip any part of the video and watch it till the end so that you can understand it very well. And please do like, share, subscribe my channel, and please comment too. So, dear friend, the main objective of our lecture is to understand the origin and the development of Metaphysical School of Poetry. Its contribution to criticism and literature at the same time. We will also try to understand the essential characteristics of the important poets, essential characteristics of Metaphysical School of Poetry. We will also try to understand the social and the literary scene at that particular point of time when this Metaphysical School of Poetry was very popular. And by doing this, we will try to widen the scope of our knowledge by understanding the major school of poetry in the history of English literature. So, dear friend, let's start. By the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, the great Elizabethan poetry had exhausted itself, and the sign of the decadence were visible everywhere in literature. Everything was conventional, everything was artificial. There was little about the original and remarkable. In the first decade of the 17th century, we see a revolt. There was a revolt against the outdated Elizabethan poetry, and the leader of this revolt were Ben Jonson and John Donne. Now, both of them were very powerful personalities and founded the schools. Ben Jonson founded the classical school, which flourished in the age of Dryden and the Pope, while John Donne founded Metaphysical School of Poetry. Now, English metaphysical poetry is very rich and full of the wide ranging in the English language. The term metaphysical or the metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of the Renaissance tree. Now, let us first try to understand the meaning of the word. What is metaphysics? Now, meta means beyond and physics means the physical nature, the surrounding. It means that beyond the physical nature. Now, metaphysical poetry means the poetry that goes beyond the physical world of the senses and explore the spiritual world. Metaphysical poetry began early in the Jacobean age and in the last stage of the age of Shakespeare. But the term metaphysical may be applied to any kind of poetry which deal with the spiritual and the philosophical matters. But it is limited to the work of a group of poets of the 17th century. Metaphysical poetry is a revolt against the particular Shakespearean or Elizabethan kind of poetry. John Donne was the leader and the founder of the Metaphysical School of Poetry. Now, it is often said that who coined the term metaphysics. Okay. So, the credit goes to the John Dryden, who used this word for the first time, and he said that Donne affects metaphysics. But later on, in the 17th century, when the Dryden in his discourse said that Donne affects the metaphysics, And later on, Dr. Samuel Johnson borrowed this term from Dryden's phrase and he used it to describe a particular group of 17th century poets. So Dr. Johnson, he said about the beginning of the 17th century appeared a race of writers who that may be termed as a metaphysical poets. They were the men of learning. To show their learning was their whole endeavor, was their whole business. And their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. The heterogeneous ideas are yoked together by violence. Now, who were the main metaphysical poets? Among the metaphysical poets, of course, there is a John Donne, who is a leader, who is a founder of this group. But besides him, there was Abraham Cowley, Henry Wagons, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Morwell, George Herbert, then the Robert Harry. All these are the popular metaphysical poets. Now, dear friend, it is very important for us to remember that or to keep in mind that during this particular age of time, we saw a particular two literary schools going side by side. The one is the metaphysical school of poetry and another is a cavalier group of poets. Now, let us see which are the characteristics of the metaphysical school of poetry. About the cavalier group of poets, we will talk in some other lecture. So, let us see what are the characteristics of the metaphysical school of poetry. Now, the first important characteristics of the metaphysical school is the delight in the novel thoughts and the expressions. So, just as the Elizabethan played with the words, the metaphysical poets played with the thoughts. They desired to say something unique, something new. They wanted to be singular in their thoughts and they were careless of their diction. They never looked at they never pay attention to their diction. They always pay attention to their thought, which should be very novel, which should be very unique. Now, the second important characteristics is the dramatic manner and the direct tone of speech. Now, the metaphysical school of poetry or the metaphysical poets, they use the colloquial speech. And this colloquial speech is remarkable in the metaphysical school of poetry. This is especially apparent in the abrupt and the dramatic and the conversational openings in the many poems. For example, John Donne in his poem The Canonization, he gives us a dramatic situations and he writes, "For God's sakes, hold your tongue and let me love." Now, this is what the abrupt and the dramatic openings. Then the concentrations. Concentration is the third important characteristics of metaphysical school of poetry. Now, this metaphysical poem tends to be a very short, is very closely woven, and so there is some truth when it is said a metaphysical poem is an expanded epigram. The reader is held to an idea or a line of argument. The reader is not allowed to pause or to ponder over the passage. The metaphysical poetry demands that we pay attention and read on. So, in all his poems, in all the poems of John Donne, the reader is held to one idea or one line of argument. Donne's poems are brief and closely woven. In ecstasy, the principal argument is the function of the man as a man is being worthily performed through the different acts of love. He continues with the theme without degradation. For example, he writes, "As betwixt two equal armies, fate suspends uncertain victories. Our souls, which to advance their states were gone out, hung pics her and me. The desire for concentration and the precision marks also the verse form of the metaphysical school of poetry. They invented verse form which suited to their thoughts, their diversity of the poetic experience. They preferred a line of the 8 syllables to a line of 10, and they employed the stanza of varying length into which the sense was packed. For them, neither the stanza form is important, even nor the syllable or the pattern. Their main focus is on the thought development. Now, the next important characteristic is an expanded epigram. Now, expanded epigram would be a fitting description for the metaphysical poem. Nothing is described in detail, nor is a word wasted. They use the very accurate, very pointed words. There is a wiry strength in the style, though the verse form are very simple and they are always suitable in forcing the sense of the poem. Now, the next important thing is the fondness for the concept. It is a major characteristic of the metaphysical poets. Metaphysical poets love conceits, and they there is a comparison. There is a comparison whose ingenuity is more striking than its justness. Elizabethan poetry is also full of conceit, but they used it as an ornament. Elizabethan poets used conceit as an ornament, but on the contrary, metaphysical conceit is not indulged in for its own sake. It is used to pursue, or it is used to define something, or it is used to prove a point. This is the important difference between the metaphysical conceit and the Elizabethan conceit. Both Elizabethan poet and the metaphysical poets use conceit, but there is a difference for using it. In metaphysical poem, the conceits are the instruments of the definitions, in the arguments or the instruments to pursue. In poetry, in particular this group of poets, we find the abundant use of conceit. Now, conceit is an instrument to reveal their wit. Conceit is a comparison between the two unlikely objects or things, and it is a far-fetched comparison for them. Metaphysical poets, they use the far-fetched comparison, and Dunn often use the fantastic comparisons. And the most famous and the striking comparison that used by John Donne is the comparison of the man who travels and his beloved who stays at a home to a pair of compass. Now, perhaps you have seen that compass. So, that compass is used as a conceit in the poem Valediction Forbidding Morning, where he said, "If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul fixed foot makes no show to move, but doth if the other do." By using this analogy of compass at a particular time of bidding farewell, the poet pursued his wife not to be mournful. We speak of a pair of compass, yet the pair is a one thing, and in the same way, the lover and the beloveds, they are the two, but they are one at the same time. And therefore, the poet says that the poet must depart and his beloved must stay back. She controls him, however distant he may be. She is a center and he is the perfection of his life. She is the center and The line quoted illustrates the argumentative and the pervasive quality that we see in the metaphysical school of poetry. The next important characteristics, or we may say that the charge on the metaphysical school of poetry, is obscurity. Obscurity is the important feature of the metaphysical school of poetry. And in this poetry, we find obscurity and the vagueness of the subject. The metaphysical poets often combined a dissimilar ideas, and therefore their poems are very harsh, very obscure, and very puzzling. Now, learning is again the important thing. As Dr. Samuel Johnson said, that they were the men of learning, and their poetry reveals their scholarships. To show their learning is their main object, is their main endeavor, and they twisted their vast learning for in their poetry. Due to this, the metaphysical poetry became very difficult to understand, became very obscure, and being learned, they tried to be very singular and very novel in their thoughts. Their chief aim is to say what is never said before, and therefore, as Johnson rightly commented, that they wanted to say what they hoped had never been said before, and that is why they ransacked the nature and the art for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Dr. Johnson noted that the metaphysical poets sometimes drew their conceits from the recess of the learning not very much frequented by the common readers of the poetry. They did not follow the trodden path. They had their own thoughts. They worked a new way out and to give expressions to their own thoughts. So Sir Walter Scott, he said that they played on the thoughts as Elizabethan poets played with the words. So the next important characteristics is wit. Wit is the important another characteristics. Wit is the passion, sentiment, sensuality are subordinate to wit. The heterogeneous material is compelled into unity by a rapid association of thoughts. So here we find a various allusions and the images related to the practicality, all areas of nature and art and learning, to the medicine, right from the medicine, cosmology, then contemporary discoveries, ancient myths, history, laws, and arts. For example, in the poem Ecstasy, Donne uses a belief of blood containing certain spirit which acts as an intermediary between the soul and the body. And he said that as our blood labors to get spirits, as like souls, it is as it can, because such fingers needs to need that subtle knot which makes us man. Now, in the same poem, there is a system of the astrology is also used. Now, the metaphysical poetry is also a blend of passion and the thought. T.S. Eliot, he thinks it as a passionate thinking, and passionate thinking is the remarkable characteristics of the metaphysical school of poetry. There is an intellectual analysis of the emotions in Donne's poetry. Though every lyric arises out of some emotional situations, the emotion is not merely expressed, rather, the emotion is analyzed. His poems, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, proves a lovers need not mourn at parting. For example, so let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods, nor sigh, tempest moves. It were profanation of our joys, to tell the laity our loves. Metaphysical poetry is full of passionate feelings and the logical arguments. So, everywhere we find a logical argument. The next important characteristics is metaphysical poetry is a mixture of the sensual and the spiritual experience. These characteristics appears in Donne's poetry. Some poems like canonizations, the ecstasy, even though they are not explicitly discussed here, the great metaphysical questions is the relation between the spirit and the senses. Often Donne speaks of the soul and the spiritual love. For example, in the ecstasy, he speaks of the souls of the lovers which comes out of their bodies and negotiates with one another. Then the careless is in diction. That is the another characteristics. Now, as we have talked that these poems acted against the cloying sweetness and the harmony of the Elizabethan poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a revolt against the Elizabethan poetry, and they deliberately avoided the conventional poetic expressions. They employed very prosaic words as if they were a scientist, as if they were a shopkeeper, and thus we find in their poetic words a rugged, unpoetic words. Their versifications and their dictions are usually coarse and very jerky. So, this is the important thing. Then, the affections and the hyperbolic expressions. This is the another important thing. It is often hard to find a natural grace in the metaphysical writings. Now, their poetry is full of the artificiality of the thought and the hyperbolic expressions. The writer is deemed to say something unexpected, something surprising, and what they wanted to sublime, they endured to supply by hyperbole. Their amplifications had no limit, and they left not only reasons but fancy behind them, and they produced the combinations of the very confused magnificence. Now, the next important thing, or the charge of obscurity, is often can be found on the metaphysical school of poets. This is the important charge. One of the charges against the metaphysical poetry is its obscurity. Now, Ben Jonson's statement is quoted in support of it. But in reality, the charge of obscurity cannot be sustained. Metaphysical poetry may be difficult, but then difficulty is not obscurity. Difficulty is different thing, and the obscurity is a different thing. Metaphysical poetry are sure to be difficult because of the because these poets are the men of learning. They they exhibits their scholarships. Therefore, their poems are very difficult, but they are not obscure totally. Metaphysical poetry may be make demands upon the readers and challenges him to make it out. It does not attempt to attract a lazy persons. Metaphysical poetry is a close packed and dense with meaning. It has got to be chewed and digested. Difficulty in certain places may arise due to the structure of the verse, but this is not a vice, and it is a fidelity to the thought and the feeling. Then The juxtapositions of the remote with the near, the concrete with the abstract, the sublime with the commonplace, may also render a poem a very difficult. But these poems are very enjoyable, and if you give a close reading to it, then you understand and you enjoy this school of poetry. Now, let us come to the conclusion of our lecture. The metaphysical school of poetry is very rich and almost a wide ranging in the English language. The revival of interest in the poetry of Donne and his followers like George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, then Henry Wagons, Thomas Carrow, Abraham Cowley, Andrew Marvell, has been regarded as one of the most significant features of the modern English poetry. So, dear friend, this is what the thought of this is of my thought regarding to the metaphysical school of poetry. Hope you understand it, you enjoyed it. Dear friend, please like, share, subscribe my channel, and comment on my videos so that you will get the notify my videos, and please comment too. And thanks for watching. Thank you.